Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the Garrison Institute's live webinar series. This is our forum on pathways to planetary health. And our guest today is Gerald Torres. Gerald is a professor at the Yale School of Law and also at the Yale School of Environment in environmental justice. And I first met Gerald as a board member of NRDC, the environmental organization. He has a long history in the issues of environmental justice. Before we begin today's session, I'll go over just a few logistical items. We're on a Zoom webinar, so the participant audio and video are off. You are silenced, but we're going to have time for questions at the end. Please post your questions to the Q&A panel, which is accessible at the bottom of the screen by hovering your arrow over the Q&A button. We're on for an hour today, and we'll respond to as many questions as we can. Forgive us if we can't get to all your questions. A recording of this conversation will be made available on the Garrison Institute website. We offer these sessions free of charge as a goodwill gesture to support our community during times such as of heightened uncertainty. We would welcome your donations of any amount to help us continue to offer these sessions. Thank you. And Gerald, thank you again for being with us. So we're going to have a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to this. So first, tell us where you were born and tell me about your grandparents on both sides.
So I was born in Victorville, California. It's not a place many people will have heard of. I was born actually in my grandmother's house. And so my grandmother, she's one of these people who's, the way I explain it is she's the kind of person who, when she walks into a room, all the energy in the room kind of organizes around her, right? She's that kind of person. And so I was born in her house in Victorville, California. We moved and I was raised in San Bernardino, which more people will have heard of. But I grew up in San Bernardino and then went back and forth to visit my grandparents, obviously up in the high desert. My mother's side of the family is almost entirely Indian, in the fact that they're quite, there are some Spaniards in there, but not many. And my father's side is actually a lot more Spanish, more polyglot actually. There's some Jewish ancestry on my father's side. And so I come from kind of a typical, in some ways, a typical Mexican family. That the varieties of ethnic groups, but strong Indian roots. So it's I grew up there, and my grandmother was a. It's funny, my mother didn't like to talk about this, but my grandmother was a curandera. But my mother, of course, associated that with witchcraft, right? And so she didn't like to talk about it because she didn't want people to think my grandmother was a witch. But I like to think of her as kind of a community mental health worker. People would come to the house, my grandmother's house. They'd bring their children who were feeling ill, suffering from one thing or another. She would retire to a back room and there'd be this stuff. I didn't exactly know what was going on. We were never allowed back in there. And then she'd send them off. And she was taught her skills, her crafts as a young girl. And then she passed it on, but we have no idea who she passed it on to. So that's, the mysteries of this kind of transmission remains actually a mystery to me. So that's, so they are. My grandfather was a cabinet maker, and when he retired from cabinet making, my grandmother tired of him allowing his friends to come over and drink beer for free, so she made him build a cantina right next door to their house, where at least they have to buy their beer.
So you actually said to me that this is a reflection of the syncretic nature of culture.
Yeah.
So talk about that.
Well, one of the things that when you do, when you're in the world at all, right? The one thing you recognize is that cultures learn from one another, right? And the way in which not just values but expressions of the cultures can mix. So when I think of my grandmother, for example, right? One of the things in some ways she was a very devout Catholic, right? A very devout Catholic. But she, of course, how she could carry her, Catholic cosmology in her head at the same time she carried this other, what would I assume Catholics call pagan cosmology in her head. Yet she, of course, felt no conflict, right? And that's kind of the thing that one of the expressions of syncretic culture. But when you learn anything about cultures in North America, especially native cultures, they were constantly learning and sharing from one another. And when I was doing work in the Southwest, one of the places I went to early on, and it was really a life-changing experience, was Chaco Canyon. I don't know if you've had the privilege of going there.
Yeah,
right? But you stand up on those mesas, right? And you can see 1,000 miles in every direction. And then you realize that there are artifacts from as far south as Peru, as far north as Canada, as far east as the Mississippi Valley, and as far west as the Pacific. So these cultures were weaving and trading. And you can see it in Navajo jewelry. You can see it in the churches, right? The churches, the kivas were destroyed by the Spanish, right? Because they were circular. So the Pueblo people began building square kivas, right? And they adopted many of the cultural forms. I actually written about this because it's one of the things that's most troubling to me is the effort to find this kind of pure expression, right? When in fact there's no pure expression, and you've got to be open to the way in which cultures speak to one another across time.
Right. What's amazing about Chaco Canyon and Pueblo Bonito and all that is that they're magnificently designed exactly in alignment with the equinoxes.
Exactly.
And so although they have hogans, which are the the spiritual center of that place, but the vast lines of and by the way, they're all lined up, so kivas that could be 15, 20 miles away were all actually in alignment with, if you go way up, and that we see in the South American culture. So you're right, that obviously had come from somewhere else. It's all woven together. You also said that these traditions have both explicit teachings and secret teachings.
Exactly. And part of that was when I think about my grandmother, right? There's some, I understood the rudiments of it, the outlines of it, but there's obviously things to which I was not permitted to be privy, right? And I think every culture has that. And the other thing that's important, I think, and I think you and I talked about this, is the important teachers.
Right.
Right, and the importance that teaching, or how teaching occurs, right? A lot of people, you and I are familiar with many of them, who think you can learn everything from a book, right? But of course, there are things that you can only learn by being with a teacher.
Right.
I think of music, right? I think of ballet. I think of art. I think of spiritual teachings. The access to those things which would otherwise be secret can often only come through teachers.
And the teacher judges whether the student is ready, and also judges how to transmit to the student. So yes, this is very important. And it's interesting because also the richness of the world that you described in your background is in some ways by the commodification of the world, which I want to get to in a little bit, is being squeezed out of our, so if you think about it, the cultural world that's presented today in many ways has much less indigenous richness. And I don't just mean by indigenous peoples, but from all kinds of people than the world today. So
if I can say something, make a point to that. In some ways, it's the cultural parallel of the loss of species that we see in the natural world.
Exactly.
It's you see this with plants. Plants are associated with language, right? Language are tied to what grows where, right? And as those things get lost, like the referent gets lost, right?
Right.
Uh, and so we're made poor for it in ways that in some ways we're blinded by it because we see this commodity richness, right? But in
Right.
fact, it's not commodity richness; it's just excess, right? And it's in some ways it's like the repetition of the same thing that we see in commodity in its commodified expression, but not a real deep richness that you see with species complexities.
Right. You know, what's also interesting is those peoples who had much deeper relationship with their environment. So their environments were cultivated. So, for example, the ponderosa forests of the West were created by burning or enhanced by burning, and the Brazilian rainforest, much of it is actually not is a cultivated forest, etc. So there was this mutual. Humans were actually could be the gardeners of the world. In much of our past history, we were. And if we lose an understanding of plants and we understand the secret knowledge of how to be the gardeners of the world, we become poorer for that.
Right. I mean, one of the things that in some ways broke my heart uh, was the discovery that the grassed hills of California that I grew up with were in fact, the residue of the Spanish planting things for their cattle,
Hmm.
which stomped out the native grasses in large portions of my home state. Uh, uh, and so it's it's a long process, right? It's a long process that we can try to get our hands around and try to understand. And I think the point you made of us being us people, right, being gardeners of the world, right, is actually critical. The head of the botanic garden at Cornell, um, Christopher Dunn, uh, he really understands this. And one of the things he understands about his role as head of the botanic garden is its linkage to culture, right? He's not just agricultural or horticultural, right? It's cultural. And he understands that. And he and I have had a number of good conversations about just those links.
So, another thing about the Spanish people. Um, so, talk about what it was the plague and Europe before the Spaniards came and what they brought with them.
Well, it's funny, I'll tell you this, and I haven't told a lot of people this, but obviously I'm going to tell a lot of people now if this is actually on being broadcast, right? But I had some trouble early in my life appreciating the Spanish, largely because of the stories I heard from my mother's side of the family. And they were audacious, right? But the kind of audacity that they bring, which is often reflected in cruelty in North America, right, reflects in some ways, right, the traumas that they experienced as a culture in Europe, right? And so, we were talking about the transmission of culture across time. Well, traumas are part of that cultural heritage as well, and those can be transmitted in ways that distort uh, your relationship to the place you're in and the people you're encountering. And I think I suspect, I mean, I'm not an expert, right? This is just stuff I've read and experienced, but I suspect it's some of that is reflected in the Spanish, in the way the Spanish occupied Mexico and Latin America in particular. The English too. Let's not let them off the hook, right?
No, these must have been extraordinarily traumatized people. We know they went through plagues. We know actually the people who came here, anyway. They came from a very brutal and traumatized. Europe was a brutal and traumatizing, endless wars, endless religious wars, famine, etc. So they brought that to America, and then with slavery, we
Right.
brought we traumatized people when we brought them to America. So actually, America has a deep history with that in its entire basis. And I think that's partly what we're seeing being played out today.
Right.
Maybe talk about where we are today in terms of justice, and then we'll weave environmental justice into it.
Right. Well, I mean, I want to go back to the point you just made, right? Because uh, the capacity to understand that, right, is actually really critical. I mean, there is a desire amongst a lot of people to push aside those historic traumas as though they don't have reverberations and expressions in contemporary society, right? And unless you understand those traumas, right, you're going to think that a particular activity is just a character flaw or bad behavior, as opposed to something that's actually deeply reflected in, well, I guess the culture, the expression of culture through time and trauma through time, right? And understanding how those traumas can uh, um, be reflected in the kind of the current uh, uh, relationships, right? The current openness, current uh, uh, understanding of what it means to be in a traumatized culture. And I think you're exactly right on that. I mean, uh, there's a lot of digging that we have to do in order to really understand where we are, and not just to be reactive, right? In current events, right, the current times right now, there's an immense kind of reactivity, right? When in fact the necessity is to step back, right? I mean, I don't want to be, to put this in kind of nakedly political terms, right? But the idea of you know clearing a pathway across Lafayette Park was an expression of that. I mean, that's an expression of someone who doesn't understand, right, why you have the responses that we're having today, right? And in fact, uh, uh, um, through that kind of response, and in fact, makes just exactly the wrong move, right? Just exactly
Right.
the wrong move.
Well, so there's a lot of evidence that Trump was raised in a traumatized background,
Yeah,
so what this really shows is to achieve real equanimity, racial justice requires equanimity. It requires both a personal spiritual equanimity, but the societal political equanimity of really understanding that all people are equal and having a deep commitment to healing them all.
right,
The institute that happens, the Garrison Institute, has done a lot of work in trauma and in the neuroscience of trauma and how trauma gets transmitted. One of the things is it's epigenetic. So
right,
we know that it actually can affect gene expression. We also know that um, the healing of deeply embedded trauma is very difficult. It is possible, but it is very difficult and it is multi-generational. So this requires society to have an honest conversation and actually recognize that in so many of our backgrounds, including more recent immigrants, we all came bearing trauma, that we have infused a society with trauma. So now let's go back to the syncretism of the societies, the indigenous societies before 1500 and what they wove together, and now look at the what we've all weaving together, and we need to come up with a new vision to take the best of that but in a healed way.
It's funny. I was asked. I was involved in a conversation about policing, and how we might address policing. And then I said the following thing, which of course had me run out of the room as maybe a lunatic. I'm not sure, but I said, look, until the policemen love the children in the neighborhoods that they're in as if they were their own, we're not going to solve this problem.
Exactly.
And that marked me out as a, I don't know, airhead or something. I'm not sure what, but that's the point we have to get to. That's the point we have to get to. because as long as they see them as other, or someone to be managed, or someone to be controlled, or a potential wrongdoer, right? That's like the trigger for the trauma in some ways, right? On both sides, on both sides. You know, I have law enforcement in my family. My uncle, my cousin, and his son are all California Highway Patrol. Now, my uncle, who's retired, right, said that the thing he really prizes is that in 35 years, he never had to pull his weapon, never. And he said, if you cannot de-escalate by talking, you're in the wrong profession. And, you know, I mean, you know, I'm sure we're all glad he didn't have to pull his weapon, right? But I think he knew that you eliminate risk by de-escalating the conflict where you can. And that's a really, really important skill and insight. And I'm sure my cousin and his boy are, you know, taking that insight of their father and applying it now, you know.
So I'm going to dip a little bit back into your biography.
Okay.
When you were in high school, somehow you ended up in Japan.
I did. I was an exchange student to Tachikawa, Japan, which, you know, there are these markers in your life, right? You think are that ultimately, upon reflection, become really critical moments, right? And I think getting to go to Japan meant two things for me. One is, for the first time in my life, I got to experience American culture throughout someone else's eyes, which is everyone needs to do, right? And the second thing was I got to experience this. I was living with a family, right? And their culture, so that, you know, when I arrived, they had just completed a new home. So one of the things they did when they completed the home is they have all of the workers, right, who worked on the house over for a big celebration. And they serve them this elaborate meal, right, to thank them for the work they did in building this home for them, right? So, you know, maybe we do that in the United States, but I don't think so. You know, so that was one insight. The other thing, and I remember, you know, going to Tokyo Tower, which is of course a replica of the Eiffel Tower, right? And you recognize how they understood and how to take from and learn from other cultures while preserving what they thought was core to their own culture, right? That was an important insight as well. So it was that, and how they dealt with conflict. Like, they dealt with conflict through, you know, not that people couldn't be opinionated and have strong views, right? But they didn't start by calling somebody else an idiot, right? They started by trying to figure out where they were, and then move from there. It was interesting because the family I lived with, and this was, I only appreciate just how extraordinary this was in retrospect. He was a doctor, but he was also a conscientious objector in World War II in Japan. Okay, now there's a strength of character that is, you know, I could barely understand as a high school kid, right? Right. He also was married to his wife, I should say, was a love marriage in a time when arranged marriages were the norm, right? So these were actually quite extraordinary people that I had the you know, remarkably good fortune to live with. And, you know, what lessons I was learning, I wasn't even conscious of the time. But I stayed in touch with them over the years, of course. And I recognized that a lot of my aesthetic judgments actually were reformed when I was in Japan. And so I carry a lot of the aesthetic imperatives of Japanese culture still strike me as being you know, exquisite and right.
And that also exposed you to Buddhism.
Yeah, exactly. Which is you know, an important early influence. I studied Buddhism in college, but the way a college student studies Buddhism, I went, I took classes and I read the suttas and I read the historic texts, but I never studied with someone who was a quote Buddhist, right? And so I still struggle along.
And so now let's talk about this confluence between your growth in environmental justice and the integration of environmental and racial justice as two streams of one river.
Yeah, for me, it makes sense, right? So I grew up in California at a time of great ferment. I also grew up at a time when, and thank God I grew up at this time, because it was a period in California's history when this critical feeling was just the air you breathe, and it was that the future could be made, right? The future wasn't given, the future could be made, right? Well, for a kid, that's incredible. That's incredible, right? So, I spent a lot of my youth at the beach, and as I joke to people, I wasted my youth at Laguna Beach, which could hardly be said to be wasted. But I used to hike up to the foothills and spend a lot of time outdoors. But I also did, racial justice work, and it struck me early on that the insults to our environment were kind of analogs of the cultural and social injustices that we see. And so pulling those together, it just made sense to me, right? And so early on, I think before it was a thing, talking to unions, right? Talking to social activists, and recognizing that we're still working on this. You know this, Jonathan. The idea that the environmental movement is a white movement, I think, is a pervasive myth, right? In fact, I learned environmentalism on my grandmother's farm, I think, watching the way she managed.
So what's interesting is you describe the 60s, which is also when I grew up, as this time of incredible, we were very aware of the injustices of the world, and we felt that the world was open to make a change. We entered this year, the first few months of this year, with enormous unemployment that came from the COVID crisis, a global pandemic. We saw enormous injustice in the degree to which African Americans, minorities were sicker than white populations, the disparities of health, the disparities of economics, as we saw food disparities, we saw all kinds of disparities. And then George Floyd was murdered, and we saw the enormous disparity in justice and in police treatment, and the lines of racial bias became really clear. So there was my sense is an enormous sense of between environmental devastation, economic devastation, racial devastation, pandemic. And then all of a sudden I'm feeling a sea change in which people are saying the conditions are so clear now that the path or the time has reemerged. And all of a sudden, the conversations reemerge of how do we rebuild the old economy in the old world, but I all of a sudden feel there's this opening to completely imagine and rebuild the new world from the devastation we're in. So talk to me about that.
I absolutely agree with you. It was hard not to be despairing early on, and in the county that I'm living in, there have been 1,300 deaths in a relatively small county. So the COVID was a real thing. The economic impact is a real thing. But what it has done, I think, is exactly what you suggested. Like, it's forced people out of those old positions, and it revealed the fragility of the systems that we've created. Whether it's the fragility of our food systems, the fragility of our economic system, certainly the fragility of our healthcare systems. Right. And the idea that we're going to go back to something that just puts us in a position where we're likely to be, subtrolls again, I think has struck most people as crazy. that this is the time when we have got to re-engineer our economy, our culture, our society. And we don't exactly know what it's going to be yet, but we know it's not going to be what it was. I said something to my daughter, which probably sounds a little nutty, right? But because she was feeling, she just graduated college and if you just graduated college right now, it's not a great time, right? And I said, darling, when you're my age, you're going to be glad that you were alive now. You're going to be glad that you were alive now, because this is where the future can be born. And I really believe that. And it's not just, I think, my own, optimism that it's a character flaw, I concede, my own optimism. But like you, the people I've been talking to, and I've been talking to people all around the country, right? They know, right, that we can't go back to the way it was. So even say the idea of defund the police, right? Once people start to unpack what that means, and they recognize that when someone's having a mental health crisis, right, you don't send an armed first responder. That's the wrong response. And recognize that it's the wrong response, and go down the list of needs that people have. That public safety, right, is a broad idea. And it's not about disciplining the population. It's about actually providing safe places for people. They can get healthcare, they can get food, they can get police when you need them in the old-fashioned way, right? But you don't create a safe place by having these disciplinary aisles. Right? And I think that's one of the insights that's coming from this. It's not going to be a smooth road. It's absolutely not going to be a smooth road. There's going to be pushes and pulling in one direction or the other. People are going to try to vilify one side or vilify another side. But I think the kernel of transformative change is actually here. It's actually here.
Right. And where does, in that transformational change, where we are so focused on racism and racial biases and individual and collective justice, where does planetary health, meaning all human beings, but even more meaning all species, fit into that? Is there a space in the dialogue today to think about all species?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, when you start thinking about planetary boundaries, right? And you step back and you ask, to what extent are we approaching those limits, right? Because as the reality of physics, right, do have a limiting factor on what we can do, right? Right. As I often joke, you don't have to believe in climate change; it believes in you, right? And so there's limiting factors, and part of what the Reformation that you and I have been talking about right now involve recognizing what those limitations are and why the systems that we create can't push against them in a way that imagines that they will yield. Right? That is, there is plenty, there is enough, right? But how we make sure that enough doesn't mean that the future is foreclosed is the critical dialogues to be had, I think. I mean, I've talked to people who are involved in public health, right? And one of the things that they have talked to me about is how this moment is actually getting people to understand how a public health approach that is looking at a whole system, right, is now actually, it's at a critical moment right now where people didn't understand it before, they're going to understand it now. And I think that's right too.
Right. So you're in a position, you're teaching some of the brightest students around. What do you think they need to know? Like, so what would be, not only do you want to teach, but what's the curriculum that a leader should know to be able to lead in this time?
Um, a couple of things. One, and first of all, when you talk about curriculum, right? One
By
thing
the
that
way, I don't mean like you can say
yeah,
stuff that's written, but it's also like wisdom. What do we
yeah,
mean?
no. Like for example, one of the things that I do in my classes, for example, is I assign literature, right? And so wait a minute, aren't you teaching a law class? Aren't you teaching a policy class? What do you, why am I reading, this novel, right? And I start class with two things, and I think these are important. One is you have to try to imagine yourself into the life of another, right? And literature is one way to do it, right? And unless you can imagine yourself into the life of another, it's impossible for you to be truly compassionate or to understand what that person, how that other person understands the world. So I'm teaching a law class, right? And I say this, and what I say is, if you can do that, you're going to be a better lawyer. You're going to be a better lawyer, right? Yeah, it sounds airy fairy, and it sounds, but it's not. It's like, this is a practice that the humanities permits us to learn and to do, right? So there's that. Second thing is you have to be willing to take new evidence and change your mind, right? So when I tell my students, I say, okay, and I got this from Stuart Brand, the Whole Earth Catalog, right? He said, look, my view is I want you to make your opinions strongly stated, strongly stated, but loosely held, right? He said that means people need to understand the position you're taking, but you've got to be willing to change your mind in the face of a better argument or new evidence. And so that's what I tell my students. I said, so when you're taking a position, I want you to state your position as clearly and as strongly as you can, so that all of us, right, can understand what you're saying and try to understand why you're taking the position you're taking. On the other hand, you've got to be willing to change your mind, just as we've got to be willing to change our mind, right? And that's the process of learning. I mean, so that's if integrating those two ideas into the curriculum, and then, and this is, I think, important. This goes back to earlier in our conversation. Imagine that you, the student, right, you, Jonathan Rose, right, can be an agent of the future. That is, and in fact, it's almost an obligation. It's almost an obligation, especially if you're at a place like Yale,
Right.
where people are investing a lot in you, right? You have to pay that back, right? And you pay that back not through your own self-advancement, right? But by learning as much as you can, and then figuring out how you can help make the future better, right? And recognize that you're uniquely positioned in many ways to do it, right? So none of this excuses, no excuses, right? Do it.
So this actually ties into Buddhism and the Bodhisattva vow, which is that you do all this learning for the benefit of all sentient beings. I'm going to suggest that we open up the chat box for questions, and as they come in, I have one more question for you.
Okay.
So I want you to talk about muddy waters from the environmental point of view about waters and from the musical point of view.
Well, two things. I want to tell you Muddy Waters' real name, right? Muddy Waters' real name is McKinley Morganfield. Now, what a great name is that? McKinley Morganfield, right? Now, Muddy Waters, from an environmental point of view, right? You can think about the, and this takes us back to thinking about the way in which irrigation canals are built, right? And think about him working on a plantation. Think of him hoeing those irrigation hose, right? And he claimed his mother called him Muddy because he was always playing in the waters. I don't know, who knows whether that's true or not, right? But the other thing that he did, and I might have told you this story, but George Balanchine and Muddy Waters died on the same day in 1983. And I was sitting at lunch, and I had the New York Times, and I was with a group of people. And George Balanchine, of course, gets a front page obituary, right? And Muddy Waters, meanwhile, gets a page 42 or something like that obituary, right? And so I said, this is a horrible shame, right? We have two great artists, and the failure to appreciate them is devastating. And one of my luncheon companions said, "Oh, come on. George Balanchine was a great artist. Muddy Waters was just a guitar player." At which point, I realized, I almost have nothing to say to you. Right? If you don't hear the artistry and the linkage across time that Muddy Waters was producing, and the invention of modern, electric blues, and then pushing that out into the future. There's no rock and roll played today doesn't owe something to Muddy Waters, right? All dance owes something to Balanchine, right? And the other thing about it is they were both the same kind of teacher. That is, you taught by taking a student and teaching them. You build a ballet on someone, right? You choreograph by teaching them the dance. Muddy Waters, if he were known for nothing else, would be known for building the best blues bands in the world. So it was like graduate school. If you went through Muddy Waters Blues Band, you could play. Right? So there's that.
So these are really stories about lineage too.
Yep.
They're really about the lineage and transmission of knowledge. It's interesting because also you mentioned to me that when you're in Japan that you saw things both horizontally and vertically, that those tapestries were woven together. We're in this digital time in which we have access to such a huge amount of information, but we may not have the guidance through it to find the true threads of lineage. And threads of lineage, by the way, the Garrison Institute's work, we've always said, is based on lineage traditions. Lineage not only carries back the deepest roots of knowledge, but they're also a filtering system.
Right.
Because the stuff that isn't really essential doesn't make it into the lineage.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, we were talking about the Spanish earlier, right? And the Spanish, of course, carried through lineage from the Arab world, right? So the Aguasillas in New Mexico, right, were in fact part of the Arab lineage in the New World. Right, some of the silversmithing we see in Indian jewelry carries with it through the transmission of the silversmithing from the Spanish to the native people to today, right? Back through the Arab traditions, right? That is everything carried forward? No, right? But these things that are valuable, and some of them are aesthetic, just aesthetic, right? Are what is part of that filtering mechanism that you talked about. And I think it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true.
So, a couple of interesting questions. From Brenda asks, where's the reconciliation between cultural trauma and environmental justice?
Where's the reconciliation?
Yeah.
I think it's going to be found in two places. One, in the remedies for environmental problems, and the transformation that rethinking those remedies has on production, right? So and let me explain a little bit. One of the terrible insights that I had a while ago, because you think, oh my God, my whole life has been wasted, is that we learn these elaborate systems of pollution control. And there's a reason we did that, right? Because we had economic and production systems, and we were trying to limit the pollution, the output, right? At the back end. When of course the reality is throughput and managing production at the front end so that you're not producing all this pollution at the back end is the path we ought to be on, right? So the reconciliation is going to be found in reimagining systems, right? That's where it's going to be. That's where it's going to be found, I think. That's a hard process because, you know, we have a fully elaborated, you know, production economic system, right? But some of the things that we thought were fully elaborated to produce efficiencies, like just-in-time manufacturing, are also sources of fragility. And now we see that, right?
Yes, actually, this idea of where a system, so one of the things about systems resilience and fragility is that resilience comes from spare capacity. So it comes from an ecosystem that can absorb a drought. It comes from a cultural system that can absorb a recession.
Right.
Joey Gates asked, do you have examples of how to take steps to transform a culture of control as a survival tactic to one based on care and relationship building in a time of great fear and uncertainty?
Um, do I have advice? No, I don't have advice, but I think you can look around um, and look at the way in which people respond to one another and the real needs, and reinforcing those real needs, the satisfaction of those real needs is critical. You know, it's one of the things my mother used to, she says stuff. My mother's actually, I think, a very wise person, although, you know, she mainly, I think, spent her time beating me on the head. One of the things she said is, you know, is that people help each other. She said, and poor people often help each other because they know what it means to be poor, right? As opposed to just being acquisitive. She also said that you build communities, and that strength and spiritual sustenance comes from the communities you construct, right? And the construction of the communities is in your power, right? And so I think Joey's this is not a good answer to your question, but, you know, you see like co-ops are one example, right? I know Joey's doing something called Dish Truck, which is a way to eliminate waste, right? That's rebuilding a system by thinking differently about how something that we take for granted, say convenience food, right, ought to be made available. You know, we can make it available in a way that actually reduces waste as opposed to just producing waste.
So Henry Jones III asks, please give your rank-ordered homework of books, environmental justice, etc., as there are many well-meaning and even progressive folks who don't have that training, and compare it to the recent list of books circulating on social media for privileged Anglo folks hoping to be woke. And then I gotta say, he signs as your fellow harp player. Are you a harp player?
What's that?
Are you a harmonica player?
I'm absolutely a harmonica player. Are you kidding? I played once. This is okay.
Yeah.
Because, you know, when you're 17 years old, you don't know just how terrible you are, right? Yeah. And so I used to sneak into bars and hear my heroes.
Right.
Muddy Waters himself introduced me to Little Walter's sister. Now, if you're a harmonica player, you know who Little Walter is.
I'm a harmonica player.
I know you're a harmonica player, right? So it was like I was being introduced to royalty. I mean, honest to God, there's this beautiful Black woman sitting next to Muddy Waters at the Keystone, Berkeley. Who knows how many years ago, right? And I went back, you know, and he introduced me to him. Junior Wells, you know, Junior Wells taught me how to play roller coaster, right? And I took lessons with Junior Wells, Paul DeLay. You know, I mean, these are great harp players, right? When I was really a kid, I asked T-Bone Walker if I could sit in with him. Now, I want you to know, only someone who was living in the state of delusion would have imagined that was an appropriate request. So books. You know, From the Ground Up is a really useful book. Luke Cole and Sheila Foster. I'd recommend starting there. The the um, I hate to recommend my own book, but but The Miner's Canary, all right, talks about uh, race in ways that might be useful for people, and environment in ways that might be useful for people. Um, the there If you start, there's a number. The bookshelf is very long, right? Um, uh, I should have come prepared to give you a list of 10 books, right? I know that on social media there are some lists that are already out there. I would take a look at those. Um, uh, the Ranging from the one that's produced in Time, New York Times, to the one that's produced in Marie Claire or Elle magazine. No one would have thought those magazines would be places that you'd look to for guidance and reading, but they are, right? Even things like Teen Vogue, if I can, which you wouldn't expect to give you insight into what you ought to be reading, but those are places to start. Um, I the book I assigned this last semester is a book called American War by I'm blanking on the fellow's name.
We'll look it up.
Look it up. It's about America in the future when climate change has already moved us past, right? And the war is about resources, right? So you start with that book, those books, and then they'll lead you in a lot of directions.
And when you get a chance, email us any other thoughts and we'll post them.
Okay, perfect.
All right. Suzanne asks, this question is a bit out of the blue because it wasn't discussed much, but I was wondering, how do you see social responsibility of climate change, um, considering that those who pollute the most, like US, are those who are going to be affected the least?
Well, two things about that. One is uh, we're going to be affected profoundly. Now, our capacity to adapt might be better because we're a richer country. But one of the things we've seen in the last few months, of course, is exactly the fragility of the systems that we're depending on to get us out of this. We can't go down those paths. So the responsibility is to look where we are now, figure out what, to the extent that you in the area that you work, right, where can I make changes that are going to improve the resilience and reduce the waste in the systems that we occupy and what I use, and to recognize that the people who are going to suffer in the short term are those people who are already suffering. They're going to continue to suffer more, but we're not immune to that suffering. And just like we talked about the cultural transmission of trauma, that's actually a global phenomenon right now too. And how suffering is responded to will help define some of the policies that we develop, both on a pragmatic level, that is what we actually do in the physical world, right? But also ethically and spiritually. And I think we've got to take that seriously too.
Yes.
So
thank you. That was a great answer. And by the way, somebody made just as a comment that follows, 12-step communities build spiritual sustenance through a particular methodology. And actually, so as much as we need true solutions, we need true practical solutions, whether they be legal, technical, economic, transformations to solar, etc. There's a there is a, in this point about spirituality that talk about the underlying spiritual or ethical or moral transition that we have to make.
Well, I mean, the building a community where you recognize that the material decisions we make, right, have ethical dimensions is critical. And those ethical dimensions are, of course, also spiritual, have spiritual dimensions as well. But not thinking of it as an add-on or an afterthought, but in fact, integral to the actual material changes we make in the world and in our own lives, right? I think to me, that's the best way to approach it. It's hard though. It's not, none of this is easy. I mean, for easy, would have been done already, right?
It easy would have been done already, but also if we had a different frame of mind, it may have been done a little better.
Right.
So Eric asks, what is your take on unlimited growth as a belief system that seems to be so deeply embedded in industrial societies? And I just want to add to this, I'm just astounded that in the last 10, 20 years, that economists still, whenever you read the economy, they go, and we didn't grow, as though, so I think there's two sides to this. So what about well, let's start with your take on unlimited growth.
Well, I mean, refer you back to the early part of our conversation, there are limits.
Right.
Right. And so the first thing is recognizing what those limits are. The other thing you need to recognize is the capacity to produce also has to contain the capacity to reproduce. Right. The resources. Right. So that's going to be an actual real life limit. Right. It's actually going to be a real life limit, but it also means that cultural reproduction has a material dimension, so that to the extent that we want to reproduce cultural forms, we've got to ask ourselves, what is that in terms of the material surplus we're trying to create? How is that going to be used? Unlimited growth is, to me, that's the technological utopians, right, cling to that, right? I've met a number of people who say technology has always solved the problem, right? And I think that's not right.
Great. Well, Gerald, thank you for your fantastic thoughts.
Well, just having a conversation, Jonathan,
Anyway, it's been I really, really have appreciated this. Support us. Consider making a donation at garrisoninstitute.org. May everybody be happy, healthy, and safe.